we're pivoting for a video to One Piece, because someone on the Patreon asked me to cover it. So what do I think a Logia fruit awakening would look like? Can we use pattern recognition and selective analysis of the story to make an educated guess? And when we come up with our best guess for a Logia awakening formula, will the abilities of certain characters we've already seen in the series line up with what we think the awakenings can do? Kind of like Luffy's Gear 4. Would certain characters maybe have methods of partial awakening that would also explain why Chopper seems to be able to turn demons human with his human fruit, when we haven't seen him go through a proper devil fruit awakening? Devil fruit mechanics can vary wildly, even in the same category. We've seen Paramecia that act like Logias, Zoans that act like Paramecia, and while there are patterns in different ways different devil fruits can work, especially within the three categories, they can pretty much operate through whatever means are necessary to fit some kind of concept. Buggy can split his body into multiple pieces to avoid cutting attacks, Moria can interact with shadows, Katakuri can substitute parts of his body for mochi, and Sugar can turn people into gadgets just by touching them. So there can be trends where multiple Paramecia create and control substances, or modify people on contact, or augment the user's body, but as far as the mechanisms behind abilities go, they can pretty much use any principle to work. And just like those Paramecia, there's no guarantee that two devil fruits in the same category use the same principles for their abilities. So is it even possible to come up with a general formula for Logias? Personally, I would say yes, because while the mechanisms can pretty much be whatever, what if the concepts, the themes for each devil fruit, are what connect what they can do together? Is it possible that the biggest way devil fruit categories differ is in their awakenings, and that an awakened devil fruit will resemble the rest of its category more closely? To phrase that another way, is it possible that devil fruits awaken in similar ways depending on the category? When I first started reading One Piece, my assumption was that the three devil fruit categories were made up by people identifying patterns in how they work, so it's easier to identify them when they show up in the wild. And that was why sometimes their mechanics blurred the lines. But we still don't know where they come from, and even the elders use typing to analyze their behavior. So considering devil fruits are tied to different ambitions, then instead of it being that the categories are just labels made up by society to spot patterns within devil fruits, what if every devil fruit does genuinely belong to three distinct types? Because while their mechanics might overlap, what if their purposes are where they differ? The premise of Zoans is that they let you turn into an animal. There's some other type of creature you want to be, a Zoan lets you do that. Supposedly they're the easiest to replicate, because most Zoans simply work by possessing a user's body and injecting them with the properties and structure of a specific creature, giving the user the ability to shift between three different forms. One where they're fully human, or whatever species they started as, one where they're fully the animal, and a hybrid in between that borrows traits from each form. Overall, a Zoan lets you add the strengths of an animal to your own, and because you only have one body, sometimes physical traits or specific shapes that only one of the two creatures you have strength from are the advantageous traits you want. So that's why a standard Zoan devil fruit gives you three options for how the two body types you draw power from settle together. The vision and flight of a hawk can be useful, but being in the shape of a bird can make you more aerodynamic, while there are times being in a human shape can come in handy. And sometimes you don't even need those traits, and you'd rather blend into a crowd. Since the concept and theme of a Zoan is gaining the strengths of an animal, it gives you variety in the forms you can take, because different parts of the body's shape you have to pick between can count as strengths in different scenarios. If you awaken a Zoan, the limiter to the ability that makes it usable for anyone is removed, which has two effects. First, the template for the Zoan creature can be injected into your body without restraint, which means instincts and characteristics of the animal can overpower your own reason if you don't have a strong enough will. But the benefit is that without this filter, your strength and the animal's can multiply together, and second, you can learn to more freely choose how your two forms combine. Instead of having three distinct forms, since you're now merging your two bodies manually, your range becomes more of a slider in between those two extremes. The premise of a Zoan is adding the strengths of an animal to your own, so you can become an animal in a beneficial way. There's a limiter placed, automatically regulating how the two bodies combine to specific templates and preventing you from fusing so directly that the animal's instincts can override your own. When you awaken a Zoan by removing the limiter, you can more freely customize how it shapes your body, and you can also embody the traits of the fruit more directly for greater power. Not all Zoans work the same. Instead of giving him 3 forms he can choose between, Luffy has a property permanently applied to his body, although that idea of having 3 forms because of different trade-offs does become part of his skill set when he trains his haki and starts tapping into the true nature of his devil fruit. The important part here, though, is that even though his base devil fruit works differently, the awakening follows the same concept as any other Zoan. He can fuse with the template for the sun god more directly, granting him more power, and it lets him change the shape of his body more freely. Even though the base mechanics for the Zoans differ, every awakening we've seen follow their category's shared purpose. Paramecia are meant to give their users new abilities, to make them capable of something they couldn't do before. They might become immune to chopping, they might be able to modify memories, they might be able to turn into a jacket, which is an underrated fruit by the way. When a Paramecia awakens, the improvements follow this purpose. It takes a lot of stamina, but by removing the limiter, a Paramecia user has more freedom over what core mechanics their fruit lets them use, to let them use their ability in more varied but draining ways. Eustace Kid and Trafalgar Law are the most direct examples of this. The other awakenings we've seen allow the users to transmute their surroundings into substances they can normally create and control, but when you break down their mechanics, they'd still fit this theme. Creating a material from nothing is super taxing, and it involves transmuting either energy or another material to make it. With this principle in mind, it's understandable that Doflamingo's string fruit would naturally put a limit on how much string you can make. The fruit's most effective at letting you pull strings over distances. But if you ease up on this limiter, it makes sense you can burn through your stamina to mass convert entire solid objects around you, or connected parts of larger objects, into the substance your ability is meant to allow you to manipulate, since the devil fruit's premise is about the ability to do so, which would also be why Katakuri's devil fruit has an awakening that works the same way. This is where Katakuri's mochi fruit would differ from Logia's. Katakuri's devil fruit acts like it's a Logia, but it's a lie. The premise of a Logia is that it lets someone become a force of nature, which is why they're so popular with admirals, enforcing an order on the world around them. It could also be the other way around, where people with Logias are more appealing to the WGO. Devil fruits possess fruits to give gifts to people with trade-offs, and Zoans seem to have a mind of their own, presumably because they work by having a template of an animal and fusing that template with people, so you could also inject it into something inanimate and that animal still has a life and personality of its own. But fate is a major thing in One Piece, and whether it's by coincidence or not, all the characters that have devil fruits have particular rigid aspects of their personalities that fit the devil fruits they get. Trafalgar Law gets the surgery fruit, and he makes overly tedious schemes to try to solve very specific problems in roundabout ways. The admirals all get devil fruits that match whatever flaws get them to contribute to the WGO, because that's the theme behind them. The admirals are all different examples of reasons people with their own autonomy might use that autonomy to enable and support some kind of order like that. Aokiji is compassionate like Garp, but he's too passive and chill. Kizaru just wants to get life's obligations and chores done with, so he's a really sloppy guy, but is super quick to complete orders, no questions asked. Akainu's the aggressive type who can lean into some authority to satisfy his own feelings, so he has an incentive to believe in strict order that's powered by people ruling through force and aggressively barking instructions at each other. So he gets lava, heat but backed by a solid foundation of the earth itself. Green Bull is a parasite, someone who will contribute to a larger system because it gives him personal advantages over others. So his fruit lets him drain resources from people and living beings around him. Logias under the WGO let the people in charge of the world weaponize the world's natural resources against it. Fujitora is the only exception we know of, someone who's been an admiral during the series, but who doesn't have a Logia, assuming Green Bull's Logia is legit. But the trend still works out for him, because Fujitora's deal is that he's been drafted against his will. His devil fruit weaponizes gravity, because conscription was something that happened outside of his control that was forced onto him. He ignores the problems of the WGO and lets it do its thing, because he thinks there's nothing you can really do against it, which is why instead, his efforts are focused on doing the most for other people you can while contributing to the WGO's plans. That's why it fits fits, he weaponizes a force like gravity that crushes people with unbearable weight. He does not have a Logia because he doesn't voluntarily turn something he draws power from into a force of nature. And for the very opposite reason, Katakuri also does not get a Logia. The Whole Cake Island arc is an example of a smaller authority system like the WGO. Someone gets to be a local emperor, offering security in return for responsibilities and taxes, but really they're acting out of self-interest, exploit their civilians disproportionately, and have set this whole place up to allow themselves to prey on any of their civilians if they're ever in the mood. This is why Linlin really likes to eat food, especially sweets. She'll have episodes where she'll single-mindedly eat anything in front of her and chase after sweets, but she also knows she does this and allows her society to work the way it does because it's a platform for her to be able to do this and satisfy her own desires whenever she wants. Katakuri is specifically the type of person who will fight for a wider system that might be bad for people overall because he's too worried about worst-case scenarios. There's security in letting the powerful bad guys do their things. So his future observation haki is exceptionally strong because that's what he focuses on, and even though he's compassionate and thoughtful, his prioritizing of the well-being of his siblings keeps him working for Linlin. Linlin's children work under her, putting their own dreams and safety at risk because it seems easier or more realistic than alternatives for whatever their specific desires are, given their various personalities. So a lot of them have devil fruits that let them create sweets because they give in to her. Katakuri does not draw strength from the status quo. He appeases a smaller authority, a false one trying to be the status quo, as their strongest soldier. So he gets a fake Logia that isn't a natural element, but a man-made sweet. He appeases Linlin and works for her to make her akin to a status quo. So he gets a Paramecia that functions exactly like a Logia. But the theme of the fruit is not that it lets him draw strength from and become a force of nature. It lets him try to force a new one into existence. The devil fruit concept is about letting him do something like a Paramecia. So when it awakens, the mechanisms behind that ability can be used manually in more stamina-taxing ways to generate mochi from entire solids and over distances. And this finally brings us to the difference with Logias. Because the purpose of a Logia is that it lets you draw strength from and therefore become a force of nature, part of the status quo, the default ability is that it lets you substitute your body with a specific material, and through this you can create and control more of that material. You're making yourself untouchable by becoming one with the world itself, because your devil fruit is making you into one of its building blocks. Logias don't have scientific elements. They're more general conceptual materials that make up different environments across the world. So it's more, they're substances that can be found in large quantities, that entire types of environments, or maybe even some islands could be made from. Materials that could represent their own biomes, but also universal building blocks of the world and stuff. And they have some kind of theme attached. Mud sinks, darkness absorbs, light has speed, ice freezes. So these devil fruits also let their users perform these kinds of effects. Not every environment has sand, but if the conceptual element that material represents is things being broken down over time and becoming bitter, like Crocodile himself, then the sand fruit and its ability to dry things makes sense. Logia abilities are naturally useful because they make you intangible, but because your power is drawing from and identifying as an element, it's vulnerable to the weaknesses of that element. You can't transform into your material if what it's weak to is present and making contact with your body at all, like how water could deactivate Crocodile's powers, or how Blackbeard needs to cover things up to use the Darkness Fruit's powers against them, and otherwise he can only use a portion of the abilities from darkness already around him that he spends stamina to extend. Based on the default premise, an awakened Logia would improve how fully and thoroughly their user could become their conceptual element, and a basic Logia would have a limiter in place automatically triggering when someone's body would be substituted with their element, and limiting how their body morphs and blends into a substance so they could more naturally hold their shape together. And that blending is where their ability to create more of and manipulate that substance comes from, because conceptually, they are that element now. Any instance of that element is theoretically part of them, or under their dominion like they're an elemental deity, or a manifestation of this building block, of the overall world that also has its own main environments where it's in high concentrations. So I'm guessing 3 things about a Logia awakening. First, without the limiter that triggers when someone will transform into their substance, they will naturally have a form made from their substance, and it's through manual concentration that they can more intricately shape it into their regular humanoid appearance. So in theory, a competent awakened Logia user could create a new form for themselves like a chakra cloak, where they have the full color palette and textures and features of their regular body and all the details that come with it, but they're made out of this substance, so they get a passive stat boost based on the strengths of that material. They can combine the strengths of their element, adding its passive traits with their base human form. Given how devil fruits tend to work and the significance of the scarf, this would probably make them ethereal, flowy versions of their normal appearances, with that cloud scarf around their shoulders to signify they've been physically elevated beyond regular mortal humans. Second, this direct fusion with their element will give Logia Awakening users the freedom to learn how to produce more variations of their substance. It's less a physical material and more a conceptual factor of the universe and of environments. So I'd imagine a Logia user would have more freedom to produce things that fit under the umbrella of that theme. Maybe crocodile could form more types of sand, reddish or grayer ones, as long as they're not too crazy. And for the gag, maybe cacti or tumbleweeds, parts of sandy environments, would be thrown in when he produces a lot of it. Ace can already change the colors of his fire, which means he's making different types of fire. Maybe that's because the theme is about using things as fuel, more or less. But you'd think an awakening would be more generous and give you more variety over the specific type of substance, as well as the ability to generally turn things into or manifest small components of its type of biome. Third, because Logias in theme are a lot closer to Zoans, where they give you the identity of a specific thing, I'm imagining a Logia awakening will have a consequence that traps a user in a failed form if they're not worthy. The mind of the animal overwhelms an unworthy Zoan host and turns them into a mindless fusion forever. Now with the Logia, a user would not have to worry about being overtaken by a different spirit. But if they don't have the right composure, then since their default state is substituting and transforming their body to be their substance, they might revert into an amorphous and blobby form. And unless they're truly a skilled devil fruit user with strong conviction and fighting ability, they won't be able to undo the awakening and revert their devil fruit to a base state. So it's a bit of a split. It's permanent for the unworthy, which means they could probably barely use those skills to get by, otherwise they'd be strong enough to activate and deactivate the awakening at will, which means even with the awakening they could only use the benefits to a fraction of a degree that a true awakened user could. But even if you're a worthy Logia awakening user, giving into your emotions or losing your composure in an awakened state will revert you into a blobby form of your material. This lines up with how awakenings seem to work across all the categories, fitting the mechanisms behind Logias and what their purposes are. But if that's our answer, then would Caesar Clown be an example of an awakened Logia user, even if just a failed one? It's possible the gas fruit is just quirky for a Logia. If the whole thing about gas is that there are a bunch of different invisible types all around us, and Caesar, as the con artist and chemical manufacturer that he is, who tries to pretend he's above other people, is simply choosing to make his lab coat look like that, where a cloud scarf overlaps with the collar and sleeves. And that's not even an animation quirk. I started reading the manga because in Punk Hazard I thought it was odd that they kept animating his lab coat like part of it is a gas form of those scarves the merman princes were wearing when they presented themselves as gods to their people, which would eventually become a trait of people who directly evolve their fusions through their devil fruit abilities to awaken thorough transformation powers, as all awakened Zoans have a cloud form of this scarf, and Luffy gets a faint version of it when he uses Haki to improve his devil fruit transformation, tapping into the core concept more directly in his Gear 4 forms. So I checked the manga, and it is distinctly drawn as a scarf made of gas overlapping his lab coat also made of gas, but subtly to hide it within the collar and sleeves of the coat. I then kept reading the manga up until Zou because I wanted to see Zunisha animated, and by pure luck, I ended up missing out on the Dressrosa pacing. In manga form, it was an incredible and refreshing arc. Anyway, if that stuff is the case, and Caesar Clown and his gas fruit are simply meant to be quirky, so Caesar's a pure fraud, then he could have totally been using the base version of his Logia the whole time. But do keep in mind, when he loses his composure, he turns into a blob of gas. When he maintains his composure, and he has a complex human appearance, the stuff he's wearing passively turns to gas anyway, while keeping its structural complexity and colors. And he makes a million different kinds of gas, and no other devil fruit works like that. Caesar Clown is a massive fraud who does not have the mind of Vegapunk. He doesn't get how devil fruits work. But he can go through the motions of some of Vegapunk's experiments, and he's good with chemicals that can alter the abilities of devil fruits. He's experimented with his own ability. He can produce artificial devil fruits. He can make humans grow into giants, showing a connection between them. And through his expertise, he improved Chopper's Rumble Ball, the thing that lets him use his human fruit to turn into a giant and seemingly access its awakening powers, from what's been going on in the recent chapters. The human fruit, which was probably designed after the Mario mushroom, gives Chopper human intelligence and lets him swap between 3 forms. But because Chopper can create chemicals, he's made this Rumble Ball that lets him access additional forms in between the default ones his devil fruit gives him, with enhanced powers, bypassing the limiter for more free control over the transformations and a greater level of power, like what you'd see with an awakening. And if he takes enough Rumble Balls, he can access his Monster Point form, where he turns into a giant, and at first, he would become mindless, similar to a Zoan user who couldn't overpower their awakening. But since the effect was caused by the Rumble Ball, he would revert afterward back into his normal state. Chopper's Monster Point was like an introduction to the idea of Zoan Awakenings, but in a temporary form he could recover from, since it was being caused by chemicals he made. Or at least, that's kind of what it feels like. Now in the latest chapters, Chopper can use his Monster Point form to turn Emu's demons human through physical contact. The other human fruits we've seen are designed around different types of entities that are supposed to have wisdom. There's a monk spirit, there's a golden Buddha devil fruit, and there's the liberation god devil fruit. When you awaken the liberation god devil fruit, it gains an ability to spread freedom and flexibility to the world and people around it. And you'd expect the golden Buddha devil fruit to spread its beliefs to other people and turn them gold and mentally free as an ability of the form granted by its awakening, because it's a golden Buddha and that's what they're supposed to do. So if human creatures spread intelligence and freedom to others, and their awakening forms grant them these abilities, the awakened pure human fruit could do this in the form of spreading humanity to others on contact, especially if they were human at their core and simply got possessed by demons or transformed into them. Now, One Piece calls a specific branch of people human, but in general, there are other groups of people that are still also human, with human intelligence and ambition and all that. They're just belittled by the WGO. So the human fruit probably does not distinguish between them. The only thing it cares about is human intellect, not which specific branch of human you are. Maybe you also need compassion, but fishmen and mink members would still be included. And supposedly, giants who have longer lifespans and more power can be made from humans by giving them the right chemicals, which Caesar Clown knows how to make. So giants, in a way, are more powerful forms of default humans. So lining up with how the human fruit seems to be modeled after the Mario mushroom, it fits why there's more than one mushroom in his backstory, because he becomes a doctor looking for a magical life-curing mushroom but gets tricked by a poison mushroom, like the green and purple ones in Mario. What if the human fruit's awakening doesn't just turn you into a basic human, it turns you into a giant and makes you larger, just like the red mushroom in Mario? This would support the idea that Chopper's Monster Point is using chemicals to force somebody whose body hasn't acclimated to their devil fruit to use their awakening form, although since the time skip, Chopper's mind has become capable of handling that transformation. If this is the case, then Caesar's assistance came from his expertise that he's already had in using chemicals to forcibly activate devil fruit awakening effects. And since the difference between a Zoan and a Logia transformation awakening would be that the Zoan becomes permanent because it traps your mind, whereas the Logia becomes permanent unless you have the level of skill to revert it, then it supports the idea that either Caesar's accidentally trapped himself in the awakened form of his Logia, or he's modified his devil fruit to remove the limiter, trapping him in his Logia form anyway. Personally, I think that second option is the most likely. He probably wore that limiter down through experiments, and he just doesn't have the skill to really make the most of the devil fruit's power. But all this is to say, I'm pretty sure that's what a Logia Logia awakening would look like. This is the kind of rabbit hole I get into for you guys on the Patreon. Next to nobody watching this channel watches One Piece. So, JJK or JoJo again next video. Unless enough people like One Piece. Let me know.